Black cleaning lady, notice symptoms. Everyone ignored. She ended up saving Millionaire CEO's life. Mr. Brooks, your blood pressure is dangerously high and your neurological symptoms are concerning. You need to go to the hospital immediately, the cleaning lady said firmly, causing the billionaire CEO to stop mid-rant. Richard Brooks, 53, owner of a $2 billion pharmaceutical empire, looked at the 42-year-old black woman with disbelief, as though she had just spoken in another language. Kesha Washington stood in her uniform, cleaning supplies in hand, daring to offer him medical advice. Richard's response was a scoff. "Excuse me?" he sneered. "Are you giving me medical advice now? And what's your background again? Oh, right, advanced cleaning." His sarcasm hung thick in the air of his opulent office on the 30th floor of the Brooks Pharmaceutical Tower. Kesha had just witnessed Richard stumbling, his hands trembling, and his mind clouded during a crucial video conference. Symptoms she instantly recognized, yet the high-powered executives on the call had ignored them completely. "Sir, I'm not just—" Kesha started, but Richard interrupted her with a harsh bark. "You're nothing but a cleaning lady," he spat. "Go back to your chemicals and let me run my company in peace. And next time, clean quietly." What Richard didn't know was that Kesha had been a registered nurse for 15 years before losing everything due to a fabricated scandal. A racial discrimination case so damaging that it forced her to take up cleaning jobs just to survive. But her medical training hadn't faded. For weeks, she had noticed the symptoms: his slowed movements, slurred speech, moments of confusion, things Richard dismissed as nothing more than work stress. Kesha knew better. Every symptom pointed to a serious neurological issue that, if left unchecked, could be fatal. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Brooks," Kesha replied calmly, with a hint of determination in her voice. "I'll continue doing my job." While Richard returned to his calls, oblivious to his deteriorating health, Kesha did something unexpected. She began documenting everything discreetly, every symptom, every episode, every time his arrogance clouded his judgment. Richard Brooks thought he was in control of his company, his empire, and everyone beneath him. What he didn't know was that the woman who cleaned his office held a secret that could save his life, if only he would stop being arrogant enough to listen. As Kesha quietly organized her cleaning supplies, her trained eyes remained fixed on Richard Brooks. She understood exactly what was happening to him, and, more crucially, she knew exactly how to handle it. If you've ever been underestimated because of your race or your position in society, you'll understand that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply being right when everyone else is wrong. Stick around to find out how an ordinary cleaning lady would become the one person capable of saving the life of a man who looked down on her. 3 days later, Richard Brooks had only worsened, but his arrogance had grown exponentially. During an executive meeting, Kesha watched him mix up the names of his own directors and asked the same question 3 times within 10 minutes. As she discreetly cleared the table, she overheard fragments of the conversation that set off alarm bells in her mind. "Richard, are you all right? You seem off today?" James Morrison, the CFO, asked, his tone laced with genuine concern. "Off?" Richard shot back, slamming his fist on the table. "I'm perfectly fine. Maybe you're just not keeping up with me. I've always been 3 steps ahead of everyone." Kesha couldn't ignore the slight tremor in his left hand, the way he blinked rapidly, struggling to focus. It was all too familiar. Neurological symptoms she had seen countless times during her years working in the neurology department at Metropolitan Hospital before her life was shattered. The scandal had started 5 years ago, when Kesha, then head nurse on the night shift, raised concerns about Dr. Mitchell Barnes's excessive opioid prescriptions. She had documented that black patients were consistently given lower doses of painkillers than their white counterparts, even when their conditions were identical. Worse, they were often quickly labeled as drug seekers. "Are you accusing a respected doctor of racism?" Dr. Patricia Wells, the hospital director, had asked during the disciplinary hearing. "Based on what evidence?" Dr. Patricia Wells had asked skeptically. 15 years of experience and 200 pages of meticulously documented facts, Kesha had replied, calmly placing her detailed research in front of them. But the internal investigation was nothing more than a farce. Dr. Mitchell Barnes, the physician she had reported, was not only a close friend of the hospital's CEO, but also a major donor. Instead of reviewing Kesha's evidence, they twisted the narrative, claiming that she was emotionally unstable and projecting racial issues onto medical practice. The final blow came when they accused her of violating medication protocols, an allegation they could never prove, but one that was enough to end her career. Within 6 months, Kesha lost her medical license, her reputation, and the chance to ever practice again. "People like you always think the world owes you something," Dr. Barnes had said, his smile cold and unfeeling. "Maybe it's time you accept that some places just aren't meant for you." 5 years later, while cleaning the office of Richard Brooks, the most powerful man in the pharmaceutical industry, Kesha couldn't help but feel the bitter irony. Richard Brooks owned the company that manufactured the very opioids Dr. Barnes had been selectively prescribing. "Still here?" Richard's sharp voice snapped Kesha back to the present. The meeting had ended, and he was glaring at her with impatience. "How long does it take to clean a desk?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks," Kesha responded. "I was just being thorough." "Thorough?" He chuckled dismissively. "You're a janitor, not a surgeon. Speed is more important than perfection in your line of work." Kesha nodded, but her trained eyes didn't miss a thing. His right pupil was slightly more dilated than the left. His speech showed a subtle delay, and his fine motor skills seemed off. Classic signs of increased intracranial pressure. As Richard adjusted his tie with less precision than usual, he sneered, "And next time you decide to give me medical advice, just remember, I pay some of the best doctors in the country. I don't need the opinion of someone who cleans toilets for a living." The cruel ease of his words stung, but Kesha kept her expression neutral. She had learned to take humiliation without reacting, a skill honed over years of being systematically dismissed. "I understand perfectly, sir," she replied, packing up her supplies. But as she left his office, a new determination took root. Kesha knew exactly what she needed to do next. That night, in her small apartment, Kesha sat down at her laptop and began typing. It wasn't a formal medical report. She no longer had the credentials for that. Instead, she wrote something entirely different. A carefully crafted anonymous letter to Richard's wife, Margaret Brooks. Kesha had done her research. Margaret, once a trained nurse, hadn't practiced in years, but she would understand the medical terms and, more importantly, recognize the gravity of what was happening to Richard. Every word was chosen with precision, each symptom documented with exact timing, every observation backed up by concrete, specific details of Richard's behavior. By 3:00 a.m., Kesha finished the letter. She read it over 5 times to make sure it was perfect, then slid it into a plain envelope. Richard Brooks thought he had silenced another inferior person. What he didn't know was that he had just awoken something far more dangerous than anger. A trained nurse on a mission to save lives, even those belonging to people who despised her. As Kesha sealed the envelope, a cold certainty filled her chest. She would not let Richard's arrogance be the end of him. Not because he deserved to live, but because she had sworn an oath to save lives. Some promises went beyond the way people treated you, even the people you were saving. What Richard couldn't see was that every insult only strengthened the resolve of a woman who had already lost everything once, and had learned she still had so much to offer the world, if only someone would listen. The letter arrived at Margaret Brooks' hands on a quiet Tuesday, delivered quietly by an anonymous courier. Margaret, a nursing graduate from Johns Hopkins University, immediately recognized the clinical precision of the language. The serious observations stood out: progressive neurological symptoms, impaired motor coordination, episodes of temporal confusion. She read it 3 times, each time feeling a growing sense of concern. Each phrase echoed the worry she had tried to share with her husband over the past few weeks, only to be dismissed with the same cold disdain Richard reserved for anyone he deemed beneath him. Margaret knew her husband had been changing. His outbursts had become more frequent and irrational. He began forgetting appointments, repeating the same stories at dinners, and his once steady handwriting now trembled like that of a much older man. Who could have written this? Margaret couldn't help but wonder as she read through the letter, poring over every meticulously documented medical detail. The writer had to be someone with formal training, someone who had been watching Richard closely, observing his behavior on a regular basis. Meanwhile, on the 30th floor of Brooks Pharmaceutical, Kesha was carrying out her plan with the precision of an experienced nurse. As she went about her cleaning rounds, she had quietly begun documenting every symptom, the times of episodes, the intensity of Richard's tremors, and the patterns of his mental confusion. She had found an unexpected ally in Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired neurologist who now worked part-time as a medical insurance consultant in the building next door. Kesha had first met her in the parking lot, when Dr. Williams had noticed how Kesha helped an elderly woman who had stumbled with careful, practiced movements. "You were a nurse, weren't you?" Dr. Williams had asked, not as a question, but a statement. Kesha hesitated, expecting judgment, but instead, Patricia extended her hand. "Neurologist for 30 years, and I can still recognize competence when I see it." That simple exchange in the parking lot led to an unlikely partnership. Dr. Williams, a 62-year-old black woman who had battled her own share of prejudice in the medical field, understood immediately when Kesha shared Richard's symptoms. Brain tumor, aneurysm, or something progressive like multiple sclerosis, any of these could be fatal if ignored. During a conversation in a corner cafe, Dr. Williams confirmed her suspicion. Any one of these could be fatal if left untreated. "Have you been documenting everything carefully?" Dr. Williams asked. Kesha showed her the notebook where she had been keeping a detailed record of every observation. Patricia nodded, her approval evident. "This man should have been undergoing neurological tests for weeks. His arrogance is going to be the death of him." The plan they devised was simple. Gather enough evidence for Margaret Brooks to demand a full neurological evaluation for her husband. But Richard was making things difficult with his constant refusal to acknowledge any problem. "Dr. Harrison told me I might be working too hard," he had dismissed recently, adding another layer to his denial. During dinner, Richard casually mentioned something to Margaret, not realizing he had referred to the dermatologist as though he were his cardiologist. "But I don't trust young doctors. They like diagnosing problems that aren't even there." Margaret exchanged a concerned glance with their daughter, Jessica, who had joined them for the meal. Jessica, a medical student in her final year, had also noticed the troubling changes in her father. "Dad, when was the last time you had a full checkup?" Jessica asked, her voice gentle. "Checkups are for sick people," Richard responded, his irritation rising. "I built a pharmaceutical empire. I think I know when something's wrong with my own body." It was that very week when the most alarming episode occurred. Kesha was tidying up the conference room when Richard walked in, visibly disoriented. "Where is everyone?" he asked, looking around the empty room. "The meeting was cancelled, Mr. Brooks," Kesha replied. "You cancelled it yourself yesterday," she added softly. Richard stared at her with an empty look, as if he didn't recognize her, even though she had been cleaning his office every day for the past 2 years. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion and annoyance. "I'm Kesha, from the cleaning staff," she responded. "Kesha?" He repeated her name a few times, as if trying to recall a forgotten memory. You said something about doctors earlier." For a split second, Kesha saw something terrifying in Richard's dilated pupils, an unmistakable blankness she had witnessed in patients with severe neurological issues. The man standing before her was slowly disconnecting from reality. "Mr. Brooks, are you feeling all right?" Kesha asked, momentarily forgetting her place. The question seemed to shake him, snapping him back to his usual hostile self. "I'm fine," he growled, reverting to his familiar, condescending tone. "And you're not allowed to ask personal questions. Get back to work." But Kesha had seen enough. Later that afternoon, she called Dr. Williams. "Time's running out," Kesha said, her voice tense. "Today, he didn't recognize me for several minutes. This isn't just arrogance. This is active neurological deterioration." "We need to move faster," Patricia replied. "I'll call Margaret directly. As a doctor, I can frame it as professional concern." That evening, as Richard slept deeply, another worrisome symptom surfaced. Margaret had noticed it herself. Then the phone rang. It was Dr. Williams. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Dr. Patricia Williams, a neurologist. I've received some concerning information about your husband's symptoms, and I believe he needs immediate neurological evaluation," Dr. Williams said, her voice serious. Margaret gripped the phone tightly, her hands trembling. "Doctor, I've been trying to convince him to seek help, but he refuses to listen." "I understand," Dr. Williams replied. "Unfortunately, it's common for patients with neurological conditions to lose the ability to recognize their own symptoms. This is called anosognosia, a result of the disease itself." The conversation lasted for 40 minutes. When Margaret finally hung up, she had made a decision. The next day, she would do something she had never done in their 25 years of marriage. She would confront Richard, and she would do it in front of people whose opinions he valued. She had arranged an informal family meeting with the board of directors to discuss the company's succession, but it would be more of a disguised medical intervention. Kesha, quietly cleaning the hallway outside the conference room, listened as Margaret explained the situation to Jessica and the directors. "My husband is ill," Margaret said, her voice steady but filled with worry. "His refusal to accept treatment is putting not just his life at risk, but the future of the company as well." What none of them knew was that in the next 24 hours, Richard Brooks' life would hinge on the courage of a woman he had long considered invisible. A woman who, despite all the contempt she had faced, was about to do something that would not only define her character, but could also save the life of the man who had humiliated her. Sometimes, the greatest form of revenge isn't destroying someone, it's saving them, despite their unworthiness, and proving that your humanity is far greater than the cruelty you've received. But the question remained, would Richard's pride allow him to accept help from someone he had always considered beneath him? And what happens when saving a life means confronting an entire system that has preferred to ignore the wisdom of those it deems worthless? The family intervention was set for a stormy Thursday, when Richard was at his most vulnerable. Margaret had arranged everything with the precision of a seasoned nurse. She had invited the 5 top executives of Brooks Pharmaceutical to a strategic succession meeting at their family mansion. Richard made his way down the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate, though he couldn't hide the slight stagger in his step. He was trying to cover up the signs of his deteriorating condition. Richard's left side was noticeably weaker, and his speech began to slur at the edges of his words. "I don't understand why we need to discuss succession," he muttered to Margaret, his hands trembling as he tried to adjust his tie. "I'm perfectly capable of running my own company." "Of course you are, dear," Margaret replied calmly, watching him struggle to tie his tie for the 3rd time before he managed to achieve something acceptable. "This is just preventive planning." In the boardroom, the directors immediately took note of the changes in Richard. James Morrison, the CFO, exchanged concerned glances with Sandra Phillips, the head of operations, when Richard referred to the marketing director as "that guy from the sales department." Richard, Dr. Williams, whom Margaret had invited as a medical consultant for the meeting, spoke up. "I've observed some concerning symptoms during our previous meetings: tremors, confusion, impaired coordination." "There's nothing wrong with me," Richard snapped, his voice rising in agitation. He slammed his fist on the table with such force that his coffee cup tipped over, spilling its contents. "I'm tired of unqualified people trying to diagnose me," he growled, his face reddening. Then, in a moment of horrifying clarity, Richard attempted to stand up to assert his health, but faltered. His legs gave way completely, and he collapsed back into his chair. His left side twitched involuntarily, his eyes glazed over as he struggled to focus. I don't wear, he stuttered, his right hand shaking uncontrollably as he tried to reach for the glass of water. Margaret quickly dialed 911, but it was Dr. Williams who took charge of the situation. Acute neurological symptoms, likely a stroke or secondary seizure. We need immediate transport to the hospital. As they waited for the ambulance, something unexpected happened. Margaret's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and to her surprise, it was Keisha Washington. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Keisha from your husband's office cleaning crew," the voice on the other end said. "I'm calling because I need you to know I've been documenting all of his symptoms over the past few weeks." Margaret froze, nearly dropping the phone. You're a nurse?" "I was," Keisha's voice cracked, filled with both bitterness and cold professionalism, "before I was forced to clean offices by people who treat me like I'm invisible." But there was something else in her tone, an unmistakable certainty. "Your husband shows classic signs of a brain tumor or aneurysm. The progressive symptoms, the cognitive decline, the tremors on one side, it's all documented in my report." "What report?" Margaret's voice trembled. "The one I sent to all of his company directors 3 days ago. The same one they ignored because it came from a mere cleaning lady." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "You sent it to the directors?" 47 pages of detailed medical observations, precise timestamps, and symptom analysis. Even a prognosis of his deterioration, if left untreated. James Morrison dismissed it as employee paranoia, and Sandra Phillips suggested I be fired for inappropriate behavior. The weight of the words hit Margaret hard. As Richard was being loaded into the ambulance, the full irony became clear. The woman her husband had treated with utter disdain was the only one who had actually tried to save his life. At the hospital, Dr. Chen's diagnosis confirmed everything Keisha had said. A slow-bleeding brain aneurysm that was causing the progressive neurological symptoms. If it hadn't been for the intervention today, Richard would have suffered a complete rupture within days. His death would have been imminent. When Richard regained consciousness after emergency surgery, his first words were hoarse. Where is the cleaning lady?" Margaret squeezed his hand, still groggy from the sedatives. "Keisha, she's in the hallway, dear. She's been waiting for 6 hours. She tried to warn me. She tried several times." Richard's eyes filled with tears as he closed them. I treated her like trash." Margaret gently wiped his cheek with her thumb. "I know. I need to talk to her," Richard whispered, his voice weak. When Keisha entered the room, Richard could barely look at her. The woman he had belittled and humiliated for so long stood before him, still in her cleaning uniform. But there was a dignity about her that made his previous arrogance seem petty, small, and utterly insignificant. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice shaky. Keisha looked at him, her gaze steady. "I've been trying to save it for weeks. You chose to humiliate me instead." Richard's voice broke as he spoke. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness." "You don't," Keisha replied, her tone unwavering. She sat down, pulling up a chair but keeping a respectful distance. "But I didn't save your life for you. I saved it because I swore an oath to protect lives," Keisha said calmly. "And some oaths are bigger than the treatment we receive from the people we save." Richard's humiliation had only just begun. In the days that followed, the full story went viral. The billionaire CEO, who nearly died because he was too arrogant to listen to a former nurse turned cleaning lady, who had identified his symptoms weeks earlier. Sandra Phillips and James Morrison attempted to cover up the scandal, but Margaret had kept records of all the communications where they ignored and mocked Keisha's medical concerns. Meetings were recorded where they had even suggested firing Keisha for inappropriate behavior. And those tapes went viral. The media turned the case into a nationwide symbol of corporate discrimination. Headlines read, "Black Cleaner Saves CEO Who Once Belittled Her." The story spread for weeks. The board of directors at Brooks Pharmaceutical was forced to call an emergency meeting. The company lost $300 million in market value within just 3 days. Richard was pressured into stepping down temporarily as CEO for medical recovery, and, more importantly, to reflect on the company's human resources policies. But the deepest humiliation came when Richard found out that Kesha had turned down all offers of severance pay and paid interviews. "I don't need anyone's blood money," she told the reporters, her voice resolute. "I need this to serve as an example. Competence and dignity aren't dependent on diplomas or skin color." While Richard focused on his recovery, enduring weeks of physical therapy to regain motor coordination, Kesha quietly returned to her cleaning duties. Yet, now, every employee at Brooks Pharmaceutical treated her with the respect she had always deserved. The man who had spent his entire life demeaning those he considered beneath him had learned the hardest lesson of his life. His survival depended on those he had once viewed as invisible. And the entire world was watching as he learned humility. But did Richard truly learn his lesson? What would become of the woman who had proven herself greater than the prejudice directed at her? Sometimes the greatest form of revenge isn't in destroying someone. It's in making them live, knowing that their existence was saved by someone they once looked down upon. 6 months later, Kesha Washington was honored with the National Heroine Award from the Surgeon General of the United States in a ceremony broadcast live across the country. The same cleaning uniform that had once been ridiculed now hung proudly in the National Museum of African American History, accompanied by a plaque that read, "The uniform of a woman who proved that competence has no color." Richard Brooks, now in a wheelchair due to the lingering effects of his surgery, sat in the front row. His hands trembled, not from the illness, but from the overwhelming emotion of seeing the woman he had once humiliated being celebrated as she had always deserved. "Ladies and gentlemen," Kesha's voice rang out through the packed auditorium, "for 15 years I was a nurse. For 5 years I was treated as though I were invisible. But today I realize I never stopped being who I've always been, someone who saves lives no matter who recognizes it." Brooks Pharmaceutical had been forced to make significant changes in the wake of the scandal. Sandra Phillips and James Morrison were terminated for their discriminatory actions, and the company instituted a diversity program that quickly became a national model. Ironically, the company's stock had fully recovered after it made a genuine commitment to inclusion. Dr. Patricia Williams, now the medical director of the Kesha Washington Institute for Preventive Medicine, beamed with pride from the audience. The institute, funded entirely by a $10 million anonymous donation from Richard Brooks, provided free medical training to individuals from underserved communities. "When that man told me to stay in my place," Kesha continued, "he had no idea that my place has always been about saving lives. He simply couldn't see beyond his own prejudices." Richard had attempted to reach out to her several times during his recovery, but Kesha maintained her distance, not out of anger, but out of respect. She knew some lessons had to be learned in solitude to be truly understood. The public humiliation Richard experienced was crushing, but transformative. He lost friends, his social influence, and was forced to reckon with decades of arrogance. Yet through it all, he gained something he had never had before: genuine humility and respect for the people he had once dismissed. "Revenge," Kesha concluded in her speech, "is not about making someone pay for what they've done to us. True revenge is becoming so great that their smallness no longer affects us." The standing ovation lasted for 8 minutes. Richard was one of the first to rise, applauding with tears streaming down his face. Later in the hallway, he finally had a chance to speak with Kesha. "I was an idiot," he said simply. "You were," she agreed without hesitation. "But idiots can learn if they're humble enough. Thank you for saving me, even though I didn't deserve it." "I didn't save you because you deserved it," Kesha replied, adjusting the medal on her chest. "I saved you because some things are bigger than how we're treated. And the best way to overcome prejudice is to show that our humanity is greater than the cruelty we receive." Richard nodded, knowing he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn the forgiveness he had already been granted. Today, Kesha runs 3 community hospitals and trains doctors in advanced clinical observation. Richard has stepped away from business and dedicated himself to philanthropy, especially medical education programs for minorities. 2 lives were saved that day, one from a brain aneurysm, the other from the shackles of ignorance. The greatest revenge against those who devalue us is not to destroy them. It is to become so extraordinary that they spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how they were ever so blind. Kesha proved that competence, dignity, and greatness aren't dependent on the approval of others, but on an unwavering commitment to who we truly are. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that our true strength appears exactly when others try to diminish us.